Hi everyone and welcome to my Season 24 Witch Doctor Spirit Barrage guide. This is going to be the number 1 DPS build in groups in high GRs, especially all the way to GR150. It will come back with a vengeance after it has been the meta in Season 20 and now it got buffed immensely by the new Ethereal weapons. The Witch Doctors get 3 very special weapons that each buff a certain type of skills on the Witch Doctor, and one of that is Ariok's Needle that gives up to 200% extra damage for Spirit Barrage, and this is what brings it back after the Bone Spear nerf. There is one other contender for the 4-man trash killing slot, which is the Scythe Necro, which we're probably gonna see especially early in the season and also especially from people running rats, but in the end game it will be this Witch Doctor build that will take the crown. Compared to Season 20, this build has been nerfed twice, but with the Ethereals you get back most of that lost power and it's only around 30% weaker or so compared to what it was back in Season 20. So it's quite close and it's gonna one-shot elite packs once properly optimized all the way up to a GR150. But the build is quite complicated to play, so here I want to show you how it's done and mostly focus on the 4-man aspects. The build works very similar in solo and in groups anyway, but there are a few different gameplay related things that you have to watch out for, and there's a lot of timing involved because of how the game works and how all the different mechanics interact in this build. So let's jump into the setup here. We have the Mundunugu set that gives you up to 20,000% Spirit Barrage damage. This is a massive bonus. There's also a very tiny mana regeneration scaling, which you can completely neglect. It doesn't really matter, so forget about that. Next, there is the Barber, which is what makes this build so special. So here it says that instead of dealing direct damage, you will accumulate damage on the target. And what this means essentially is that you don't actually deal any damage, but the damage that you would have done is remembered, so to say, and you can unleash it in a final explosion. And the more targets you have in that accumulation circle on the ground, in those little phantasms, you will deal more damage with the final explosion. And this is why this build scales so extremely well with monster density and why it's so good in 4-man high GRs. There you can stack up potentially dozens or even 100 monsters in this AoE radius, and the more monsters are inside, the bigger the explosions will be, and of course the more monsters you will kill. So it becomes easier and easier the bigger the pull is to just obliterate everything. In fact, the potential of this is so good that on the high end in 4-man pushing, we might see this Rift Guardian 2-shot strategy, where with High Paragon it is possible to make a massive pull right before the Rift Guardian spawns, click a power pylon, and then use one of your 3 phantasms to spawn the boss and the other 2 to 2-shot the boss. This is not really a very casual friendly strategy, but you can actually kill GR150 bosses without a Rift Guardian killer this way. Because Firebirds is so insanely strong this season to kind of instantaneously kill bosses anyway, we might not see that strategy actually come to fruition because it's very difficult to do. It is very RNG heavy depending on where the boss spawns and how well you can make that pull. You have to get a pylon and all this, but you might see some of those setups because this is exactly what was used as well in Season 20 on the high end. Next up we have the Gazing Demise offhand. So this is one of the items that was nerfed quite recently, and this one increases the Spirit Barrage damage by 150%, which is a nice bonus, and you get the Phantasm rune for free. This allows you, especially in solo runs, to go with the Manitou rune, which is a hovering spirit above you that travels with you and that shoots at nearby targets. So this is especially a single target rune. In groups you actually avoid that, and you don't want to have this Manitou constantly causing these explosions because it's a kind of laggy build. It's not too bad, but on really large pulls you will start lagging a little bit of this, so you don't want to have the Manitou because it doesn't really do any damage and you're not supposed to kill the boss yourself in 4-man. For solo this is required because it does roughly 60% or so of the Rift Guardian's HP, and it is actually quite useful in single target situations. Finally, there are the 2 rings. Here's Ring of Emptiness, which is a very strong Witch Doctor only item, up to 300% increased damage. All you have to do for this is press Locust Storm with Pestilence and it will spread to everything, and then you have around 8 seconds of this buff. So essentially you just refresh this once in a while and you get a massive boost here. And then there is Convention of Elements, which is also going to be very important, especially in 4-man, where you have to accumulate at exactly the cold phase and then do the pop after cold phase has ended. There are some other items here that help you with either damage or toughness, for example the Endless Walk, so this is quite useful for 100% extra damage. We have Lakumba's Ornament, which gives you 60% damage reduction, which is dearly needed because this is a Witch Doctor, and you combine this with the Sacred Harvester, which optimally you get on your Ethereal, or you wear it if you don't have an Ethereal yet. Witch Doctor also has some insanely strong passives, like the Gruesome Feast. This one gives you up to 50% more intelligence, meaning 50% more DPS, and the globes for this will be spawned by the support Barb, who uses, instead of Threatening Shout Falter, Grim Harvest as the rune to produce globes constantly and keep this buff at 5 at all times. There are also some other really strong passes like Confidence Visual, 25% multiplicative damage bonus. There's Swampland Attunement, which gives you massive resists, but you can also go with Spirit Vessel for defense. And you have Grave Injustice, which is, especially for solo play, a very important passive to keep you alive by constantly cycling Spirit Walk, getting some kills and then Spirit Walk again, so that you can stay immune most of the time. You can't really do this in groups because of the convention playstyle and the fact that you have to time everything there, but it also helps you there to also reset some other skills like Big Bad Voodoo and the Zombie Dogs. Speaking of which, in groups especially, you want to use some Zombie Dogs with Lifelink that gives you 10% damage absorb, and the Sacrifice Provoke the Pack. So you can snapshot this Provoke the Pack 100% damage buff if you stack it 5 times, and you will use this to make even bigger explosions. In solo, those two skills are replaced by Prearnado and Big Bad Voodoo with Ghost Trance usually. Ghost Trance is not really needed in 4-man, and the attack speed bonus is not really that strong because you have Pain Enhancer giving you lots of attack speed. You can proc this either from having the physical Locust Storm that will apply a bleed effect, so to say, for the purpose of this gem, or usually have the ZDH that will have Pain Enhancer equipped to proc it for you as well. In groups, you have to time your Zombie Dogs, so you always want to summon 3 Zombie Dogs, and then before you do your DPS rotation, usually during the poison cycle of the Convention of Elements, you want to sacrifice 3 dogs, summon 3 new dogs, sacrifice 2 more, and then you spawn your 3 Phantasms on the ground. All of this is supposed to happen right before your cold convention cycle, and you will snapshot this 100% extra additive damage buff for the entire duration of the Phantasms, even though the buff times out quite quickly. So again, you do the Zombie Dogs, you sacrifice more Zombie Dogs, you sacrifice again, and then 3 Phantasms, or even 4 Phantasms, in case you also want to spawn an Oculus Ring. Oculus Rings are another optimization for this setup, so essentially you want to weaken enemies a little bit by just casting a little bit into the pool, but not too much, because you don't want to kill all the small trash monsters. Remember, you scale with the amount of monsters that you accumulate on, so you optimally kill exactly 1 target and then have the Oculus ready for the cold convention where you accumulate all the damage. The way you do this is you just apply your Locust Swarm and then spam a little bit of Spirit Barrage into the pool. You have to get a little bit of a feel for how much damage you do, and you want to look at the HP bars and see when stuff starts dropping, and then as you see monsters going low and low, you want to put the Phantasms away back to some corner so that you don't actually kill them and blow them up. The way you can time the detonations of the Phantasms is by just recasting. So you can have 3 maximum, and when you spawn a 4th one, 5th one, 6th one, you will detonate the oldest ones. And this is how you can time the explosions. You try to do exactly the same in solo and in groups in that aspect. So you want to stack up enemies and then accumulate, spawn Oculus Ring, go in there and then go for the big explosions. Lastly, it comes down to timing your explosions properly. The Phantasms last exactly 10 seconds, so you don't have that much time. Essentially, you do the whole rotation with sacrificing the dogs, then setting up the Phantasms, spawning the Oculus Ring, you want to run into the Oculus Ring, and then you accumulate for the full 4 seconds in your cold convention. But you don't want to detonate all 3 Phantasms at once, because more often than not, if you do the rotation properly, you will essentially annihilate the entire pool in 1 pop when there's a lot of monsters. So what you do is you cast 1 Phantasm to kill most of the pool, and then you give the Barb like a second or 2 to do another ground stomp and pull more enemies on top of the already prepared Phantasms, and then you pop the other 2, because this way you have like a bigger circle that you can obliterate. All in all, this requires quite some practice to do properly, and you need to coordinate with your team, best case on voice communication. But in solo, you also do kind of a similar thing, just with your own Pionado. Meaning that you will accumulate, you will pop one Phantasm, you Pionado into the middle to get more stuff in, and then you pop the other two. In terms of stat priorities on your items, you typically want to have the Spirit Barrage damage where possible, and you want to avoid area damage. This build does not scale with area damage in any way, because the Barber does not produce any area damage explosions. It just straight up accumulates all the damage from what you would have done in that moment on that tick, and it remembers that value and then it produces that in the final explosion again. This also means you don't need to have the damage buffs active when your Phantasms actually explode. You just need to have the Cold Convention and Oculus Ring at the moment when you have all the monsters in the pool with your Phantasms stacking up, but then you wait until after Cold Convention to do the pop. So this works differently than most other builds, but this Barber mechanic is actually an even stronger area damage like mechanic that scales even more than the typical builds because of this more damage per target in the pool. What is important is that you need one source of life recovery and one source of mana recovery in your build. So in solo, typically have a setup like this with Captain Crimson, which allows you to go with resource cost reduction, like Blood Ritual is very useful here, gives you some life regen, gives you resource cost reduction, which works with Captain Crimson for extra damage reduction, and you also have the Big Bad Voodoo that gives you more life regen. On top of that, you need Rush of Essence if you don't use Voos Juicer. So since this is Season 24 and you're most likely going to play this with an Ethereal weapon, you're not going to run Voos Juicer, which is typically the normal setup, and this one will usually give you a lot of life and mana recovery. But here you don't have that, and you need Rush of Essence to sustain your mana. Every time you cast most of your skills, you will get a mana regen buff, and this will easily sustain your mana. While in solo, you go with the Manitou rune. In groups, you will have the Phlebotomize rune, which is very useful for healing. Especially when you have a large bull, you will essentially almost instantly heal your entire HP every time your Phantasms tick, because every time they tick on each target, you get this 6,400 life, which is massive when you have a pool of 50 or more monsters. So this is extremely useful and helps you to survive. But all in all, it is a rather squishy build in 4-man because of the large pulls that you make, and it is actually not a terrible idea to go with a Z-Monk early in the season. Especially when you play this build for the first time, you have to make sure that you do the rotations properly, and then you can essentially fit in the ZDH later on when you are comfortable to survive. It is not impossible to do this even with a ZDH at kind of low Paragon, but you are a bit squishy, especially when you don't have a perfect setup, and when you have less than, let's say, 15k intelligence or so, you are just lacking resistances, you are lacking the means to put extra vitality and Paragons and all this stuff. But later on you will be fine after, let's say, 2k Paragon and decent gear with augments. Especially with how popular monks are going to be in Season 24, I imagine that we're going to see quite some groups early on in the season running with a Z-Monk instead of a ZDH, simply because it makes it easier, and it is definitely an okay choice. But ultimately the ZDH will give you another 2-3 tiers worth of DPS or so. Unfortunately, the Witch Doctor has the issue that it doesn't really fit into any speed meta, so it will be kind of difficult to gear it up, especially if you also want to go for a good ethereal weapon. So for the most part, you have to rely on bounties and on T16 runs to gear it up. Both Mundunugu and Zunimasa, the two strongest builds on Witch Doctor, don't really cut it for any speed meta, and support Witch Doctor is also not really that great. I think the best meta to fit in a support Witch Doctor would be actually the Wave of Light monks, especially early on, because Witch Doctor actually gives a lot of damage reduction, which the Wave of Light monks can definitely make use of. And they don't really benefit all that much from a ZDH, because they have a lot of additive damage buffs themselves from that Sogrin's Gaze that makes the ZDH not necessarily redundant, but simply not as good in that setup. Otherwise, you just have to run these high GRs all day basically to slowly gear up the Witch Doctor, and this is also a really valid strategy to farm high XP values, and it can actually be quite competitive with something like Firebird Speeds and Rats if you have to have a really good team and you do this properly. At some point it will simply not really be a big deal anymore to just clear basically any 150 with your team if you have a really good coordinated team and you have practices built and everyone does their job. So this is actually gonna be a really good farming meta. In this D3 planner, I have some setups for solo or group speed setups for GR90, GR100. You can do them kind of fast, but it's simply not really up to speed with some of the other top farming builds like GOTH or Firebirds. It is a rather slow-paced playstyle because of its accumulation mechanics, because of the timing, and you can do very nice, very efficient high GRs, but for these low runs, you simply give up a lot to gain more speed. In either case, it is definitely one of the top farming builds, also for T16, for example, on the Witch Doctor, and also probably the best bounty build that you can do if you play Witch Doctor, so you definitely want to go for Mundunugu anyway. It actually has some neat variations. So for example, you can combine Restless Ring of Larceny with a 6% increased movement speed with Horrify Stalker, so you can go really fast with this. And then you have something like Permanent Spirit Walk with Ingeum to give you another big movement speed, and you can run around at like 400, 500, 600% speed all the time. And once you have a decent setup, you're gonna obliterate T16 with ease. So while it is kind of easy to play for farming, it is definitely one of the most difficult and complicated builds to push with in solo and also in groups, but it is the format meta. So you definitely want to take a close look, you definitely want to practice this a bit if you intend to play Witch Doctor next season. I have also updated the Spirit Barrage Maxwell guide recently, so there is a lot of new information if you want to go check out the written details, and there are a lot of mechanics covered there as well that I didn't really want to fit all into this video. In short, what you need to know is that you need to time your phantasms properly. You want to accumulate as much as possible on as many targets as possible, and then do timed explosions with most of the targets inside to blow everything up at the same time. In groups, you have to play around the dogs, so you want to snapshot the 100% damage buff. In solo, this is not really that important. It's more about Grave Injustice resets, so you stay alive. So there you essentially just hop from Oculus Ring to Oculus Ring and do smaller explosions, and you reset your cooldowns with Grave Injustice to stay alive. So I hope this guide helps you to understand the build better and play it with success in Season 24. Personally, I'm actually quite hyped to see Witch Doctor up there again. I believe this is an extremely fun meta. It is very satisfying to have these really huge explosions, those huge pops where you just sometimes one-shot elite packs, even yellow packs can die in one go if you do a proper rotation with a lot of targets. And it's just amazing to play the Witch Doctor. I might even play some Witch Doctor myself next season simply because it's so much fun. I did it a lot in Season 20 as the DPS, and I'm really glad to see it come back. So in any case, I hope you enjoyed this guide and you're gonna have a lot of fun in Season 24 with the Witch Doctor and with the Ethereals. Hope you liked this video, and I'll see you guys next time.